Well, hello, it's Samuel. This is what I hope to be a three-part series, and this will be the first part. This is a series where I'd like to compare a little bit and kind of rank two Roman Imperial dynasties that stand out as, in my opinion, being fairly unique, that being the Julio-Claudian Dynasty and the Constantinian Dynasty. I had kind of posed this question just kind of at random, and I didn't really find anybody talking about it, so I thought, well, here are my thoughts on this subject. Obviously, Augustus and Constantine are very influential and very important Roman emperors, and I think that their dynasties also bear some weight into that, so I wanted to see, well, who edges out as being the greater, let's say, Roman emperor and Roman dynasty. And hopefully I can figure out a way to get timestamps on this video. So here we go. We're starting out the Julio-Claudian Dynasty, reigned from 27 BC before Christ to 68 AD, 68 years after, into our Lord's Anno Domini, excuse me, the year of our Lord. For each dynasty, I thought it would be fitting to kind of give a bit of the prologue for each dynasty's coming into existence. Obviously, the Julio-Claudian is the first dynasty, so we'll have to do a little bit of digging back to kind of figure out what's going on here. So, of course, prior to the man on the screen, Julius Caesar, coming to the picture, Rome was going through a bit of turmoil with social issues regarding plebeians and other civil unrest. Obviously, the Marius and Sulla Roman Civil War is very notable, as Caesar was kind of involved in that, and he was basically a minor character that got exiled. But he did survive, and eventually not bringing down Caesar would be one of Sulla's greatest errors. You know, Sulla did see many a Marius in Caesar, and he decided, well, nothing bad will happen from that. So, here we go. Julius Caesar comes onto the picture. Roman civil order continues to kind of break down over time, and the fabric of society gets to become a bit more torn than usual. Well, lo and behold, strong, popular, charismatic, rich, Julius Caesar takes control of the situation. Of course, he really rises to fame through his conquering of Gaul and expeditions to Britannia, and he eventually is named dictator, but there is a bit of strife to go before he becomes the great individual that we know today. There was the Great Roman Civil War from 49 BC to 45 BC, where the Caesarian and Pompeian factions fought for the future of Rome, and, well, as we know, Julius Caesar was the winner of that conflict. He was named dictator for life, father of the fatherland, all of these wonderful titles. However, the Republican faction would not go down quietly, because as we know, on the Ides of March, the 15th of March, Julius Caesar was assassinated on the Senate floor. Well, rest in peace, Julius Caesar, but hello, Augustus. Imperator Kaiser Divi Filius Augustus, as most people are familiar with him today, Augustus. He took of his adoptive father's strength, charisma, popularity, and wealth, and he used it for his great advantage to eventually become the sole power in Rome. The civil wars may have ended with Julius Caesar, but they were never really truly ended because there would be more civil wars. And indeed, Augustus did play the long game, and eventually he would defeat Mark Antony and become the sole master of Rome at age 33. The argument is certainly very clearly stated and can be very clearly defended that the one person that was perhaps greater than Alexander the Great is Augustus, because at the same age, 33, etc., etc. With the settlements of 27 BC, when the Julio-Claudian Dynasty really begins, Augustus took the titles of princeps, and, well, Augustus. Before he was just Gaius Julius Caesar, and before that he was Octavius. He reforged Rome largely through his own massive fortune, building roads and aqueducts and infrastructure as well. He had a very keen vision of imperial borders and the greatest extent that the empire should take. He knew that the empire could not and should not extend beyond its means. Amongst other things, as you see here, he brokered a peace with Parthia in which he got the eagle standards back that had been lost there earlier by Crassus. He always had in his mind imperial succession because he believed that if there was nobody to succeed him, Rome would descend back into the chaos that had immediately preceded him, and that had also taken place before he was made the emperor. After ruling for 40 years, he did die in 14 AD. And one other event that I think can be highlighted is that during his reign around, 0 AD or 0 BC, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews, was born in Bethlehem. This is just, a little thing, but in fact it was a great thing because, of course, Christ came when humanity had kind of reached its peak, and if you look at the evidence, without divine intervention, this is kind of the peak. The humans can't get any better than this. So, take it. Don't insult the divine Augustus. If I was not a Christian, I would casually refer to Augustus as the divine Augustus, but I am, so he is not divine. He is just a man, and of course, Jesus Christ is God. Anyways, let's keep going. Well, for fans of the Bible and, history, you will know that Augustus was succeeded by his stepson, Tiberius, who reigned from 14 AD to 37 AD. He had always kind of been the backup successor for Augustus. Augustus never really had wanted to go with Tiberius as the main successor. They didn't always see eye to eye, and they were very different people. While Augustus was all of the things that I had mentioned before, charisma, popularity, being a generally sociable person, Tiberius was none of those things, really. He was quite moody, he was very impersonal and uncharismatic. And at the ripe old age of 55, he became emperor after having basically run the course of being the last person that was really capable of succeeding Augustus. He was famous for reviving the prescriptions because, while the people of Rome did not like him, he also did not like the people of Rome, and they both despised each other. However, he was a capable leader and he had all the skills, but he was not really interested in being the emperor so much and taking on the duties of state, which he often pushed on to other individuals. So it's said that he died of natural causes, but it's also said that he might have been killed by his successor, Caligula. Caligula picked up as the emperor in 37 AD and reigned to 41 AD. As a young child, he was a bit mentally scarred, young and sadistic. And that's just kind of him as an individual, not only just as a young child. And probably most importantly as well, he was untrained in the art of being head of state. He hadn't had the same experience that his adoptive father Tiberius had had, nor his own father Germanicus. He was only 24 when he became emperor, after all. His father, Germanicus, the very popular Germanicus, the, I believe, nephew of Tiberius, was assassinated, probably by Tiberius, when Caligula was 7. And then from the ages of 18 to 24, Caligula spent it at Tiberius's court in Capri. Now, he didn't really think of himself, this is Caligula here, he didn't think of himself as princeps, no, but as Neos Helios, a god, quite literally a god. He tried to have his statue put up in the temple in Jerusalem, which I'm sure would have gone over great. But alas, that never came to be, thank goodness. He also tried to wage war on Neptune, which he won, by the way. He did loot Neptune's shells, precious shells, I should say. However, he was a bit of a wild character, and having unchecked power and nobody to rein him in made him a very dangerous person, and eventually he was murdered in a conspiracy, which leads to our next Roman emperor, Claudius. He reigned from 41 AD to 54 AD. And despite for most of his life having been fairly sheltered from the outside world, really, as the stupid, stuttering Claudius, he did prove to be very adept as emperor, which he became at 50 years of age. He expanded and consolidated the empire, like adding Britannia as an example. He modeled his rule very closely after the divine Augustus, and taking all the measures to make sure that he could live up to that standard. Of course, adding new territory to the Roman Empire was a point of great prestige, and you couldn't really call yourself imperator if you hadn't, conquered anything. However, he did suffer many personal problems in his life, which I won't get into, but it's quite sad. However, as an emperor, he was very adept and capable. However, at the end of his life, he probably was poisoned by his wife, who was also Nero's mom. Which brings us to our, I believe Nero's mom. Which brings us to our final Julio-Claudian, Nero, who ruled from 54 AD to 68 AD. Which kind of always, it shocks me that he had ruled for so long, but we'll get to it. Because, of course, he did become emperor at 16, beating out Claudius's very own son, who was then, killed by Nero. Interesting how that works. Personally, he was very popular with the Roman people because he was a, Julio-Claudian. He did have the blood of the divine Augustus flowing in him. However, he was not as popular with the senatorial classes, who really didn't like him. The Great Fire of Rome occurred in 64 AD, which Nero blamed on the Christians, but, many people blame it on him. Nero, of course, did take, precautions to aid the citizens of Rome, but whatever. He did, of course, during his reign have Saints Peter and Paul martyred, which is, it's an interesting thing to be martyred, but, thanks be to God that through the blood of the martyrs, Rome was eventually be converted. He did commit suicide after being declared an enemy of the Republic in 68 AD, and as I had mentioned before, he was the last direct male heir of Augustus. After this, the Julio-Claudians are no more. Well, thank goodness the word assessment came to me early this morning because I had totally forgotten which word I was going to use. I had overview there, but I thought that wasn't as good of a word. But assessment, I think, is a very good word, and that is exactly what we will do with the Julio-Claudian dynasty. I've kind of split this into goods and bads, so we'll go over 4 good points and then 4 bad points. Not for any particular reason, that's just the way that I've laid them down. One good point is vision. Augustus had vision. He had a very clear vision of where the empire should be, how it would be there, and how it would get there. And, with some minor exceptions, Claudius and Trajan as an example, this vision of empire, of the Roman Empire, would remain the same for about 500 years. Those imperial borders did not really change all that much. Second point, imperial succession. This was an obsession of Augustus, who had lived through the civil wars. He knew that if there was no one with the legitimacy or the ability to take his place specifically, but whoever his successor's place would be, that Rome would eventually descend back into chaos. It would just go through the same cycle of civil wars unless somebody was able to stop it. He tried very hard, of course, to make sure that his desired successor would succeed him. However, he was consistently foiled by nature. So you could almost say this was a failure. I wouldn't say it's a failure because there's really nothing you can do about it in the ancient world when disease and, dying is just such a commonplace thing. Stability, of course, is the third point. With a few exceptions, the empire remained very stable and avoided the instability of more civil war. This is obviously a very big plus that you have to give for the Julio-Claudians. You could say that the prescriptions were not so great. You could say that Caligula was a bit of a wild card, and that was a pretty terrible time. Two bad guys back to back is not great, but overall, it was a pretty stable time if you're the average Roman citizen. And of course, staying power. The office of emperor would last and endure despite the hardships. It wasn't just a passing phase of another strong man becoming dictator. This was something that was not going to pass. Though an emperor would die, there must always be an emperor. So those are the good points that I'd like to say. Now let's go to the bad points. This is this point in particular is not something that's necessarily exclusive to the Julio-Claudians, because this is a very persistent issue, but it was the inability to annex Germania. And this is kind of the big issue that would haunt the empire for its entire existence. Augustus kind of mapped out the ideal imperial borders as being the Danube and the Elbe, but they never really got there. They stopped just a little bit too early. The massacre at the Teutoburg Forest was a massive blindsiding incident that kind of put a mental block into the mind of the Romans, and they were never able to claim the lands of Germania for the empire. And this would be a constant thorn in the side of the empires. There were always issues that were taking place on the imperial borders of Germania. You could say that Augustus gave up too early. I think that's a very reasonable thing, that he should have tried again. But he didn't. So we kind of have to take it as it is. Bad emperors is probably the second point. I think you can say that there are at least two good emperors out of the Julio-Claudians, Augustus and Claudius. Tiberius is kind of a mixed bag, but he generally preserved stability, and the prescriptions were terrible. I think you have to say that Caligula was very bad. I think there is a trend in Roman history that young emperors are generally very awful, mostly because they do not have the experience that older men that have been generals and politicians have. It's very natural. They don't have the stateship experience. We see this. Think Commodus as well, a young man who was, mostly ill-prepared despite having been given preparation. This is probably something that we don't think about too much because we have kings and dynastic successions very well figured out, but this is something that the Julio-Claudians really didn't. It was kind of just, well, I will appoint a successor and that will be who the successor will be. Despite Augustus personally making sure that he would have a worthy successor to take over, he didn't really establish any rule as to how Roman succession for the empire would work. It was kind of just a hand-pick, well, you're going to be the next guy because I say so, and you're getting the experience to do so. And this is something that would really later plague the entire empire as questions of legitimacy arise. I mean, you have different guys vying for power because there's nobody that you can point to and legitimately say, well, he has to be the next one because of X, Y reason, because he's related, right? So what do you do when the emperor dies without an heir, as with Nero? Well, we get a little bit more chaos and we get the year of 4 emperors, and then eventually, hopefully, if you're an average Roman, a new dynasty establishes itself to maintain order. And now I'd like to go to the last bad point that I would say, and this one I think is obvious if you are, a Christian, or you like people not being burned as, dinner party lights. But the persecution of the Christians under Nero is definitely a blight on the Julio-Claudian legacy. The scapegoating of the Christians was very bad. And I think that had Nero not scapegoated the Christians, he probably would have gotten by as being a barely passable emperor. I mean, the whole downfall of Nero kind of started with the fact that he was a bit of a doofus. But he did last quite a long time, despite being a doofus. So I think that without the persecution of the Christians, at least certainly amongst Christians and people influenced by Christians, he would have probably a higher reputation. Probably still not a great emperor, but not a wholly evil, terrible emperor that we really give the reputation for him today. So that's kind of the good and the bad of the Julio-Claudians. My overall assessment is that the Julio-Claudian dynasty, being the first, you always have to grade the first dynasty a bit more easily, just like in school. You kind of have to give them credit to say, well, they're making it up as they go along. They're not really following a textbook example here, so they kind of have to figure it out first. And I think for having figured it out first, they did develop a model that worked very consistently, and that, as a matter of fact, wouldn't really change until Diocletian. There are kind of two phases of the Roman Empire, which is the Principate and then the Dominate. And the Principate did last for a very long time. Eventually it was worn out. But it did last, and it did provide an existing model that would endure for a long time. The host for the History of Rome podcast, I forget his name. Is it Mike Duncan? It might be Mike Duncan. But if you look up the History of Rome podcast, he made a very interesting point that had Diocletian and Augustine switched places, both being political pragmatists, they probably would have just adopted the titles that they had. Diocletian would probably say, yes, call me Princeps, and Augustus would have said, yes, call me Dominus. And that's just kind of the political pragmatism and really political expertise that both men employed as emperor. And so I think that you really do have to give props to Augustus as the greatest Roman emperor to ever rule. I think that his 40-year rule kind of goes unmatched by anybody. You could say that, Trajan or Aurelian or Marcus Aurelius did better, but I think given all of the factors, I think you really do have to say that Augustus did really well, definitely was the best Roman emperor, no questions asked. His 40-year rule really set the precedent, and the Julio-Claudian dynasty overall was pretty good. So next time we'll pick up with the Constantinian Dynasty, and we'll see how they stack up. That'll be the second video, and then I will make a third video where we say, well, who edges it out? Who is the better dynasty? So we'll see you there next time. Take care. Bye-bye.